Everyone said that the church was cursed, from the moment the first shovel broke ground on the construction site. Instead of making a clean hole, the tip chipped on a rock, then pulled loose the body of a decayed rat. What followed were 2 years' worth of tools malfunctioning and a number of serious accidents that far exceeded the norm. One worker's arm was shattered when a wall portion buckled in. Another slipped into pouring concrete, only saved from going under by seconds. It was when the secured base of the main spire collapsed and sent several crew members to the hospital that the whispers of a curse grew louder. Nevertheless, the church was finished at the behest of wealthy landowner Thomas Mettler, who'd commissioned the building in 1895. His design had been made on a trip to Europe, based off the Gothic spires and rising stained glass windows of past architectural feats. On a smaller scale, of course. There was hesitation from the township board since there already were frequented places for faith, but the land was Mettler's to do with as he pleased, and he insisted on his idea coming to fruition. By 1897, a towering church sat at the center of the small town. In no corner was it possible to ignore. Mettler went so far as to bring in a priest to make it an official house of worship. It was said that the pastor frowned looking over the gray walls, feeling a sudden chill as he was ushered inside. He surveyed the pews, the decorated altar, and the glittering lines of stained glass windows, finishing at the freshly painted ceiling. That was when a few drops of liquid landed on his head. With a gasp, he brushed his hand where they'd hit, feeling a burn. Later, it was discovered that the liquid had been leaking acid from a faulty refrigeration unit. The incident likely would have been forgotten, but in their rush to get help, the heavy outer door slammed too hard. A statue of an angel tumbled from the entranceway as if it had jumped, top half shattering in their path and leaving the lower portion to roll toward them. The priest sent word back from the doctor that he would be politely declining the position. Thomas Mettler was furious, declaring that he'd run the church himself if the man was so unnerved by a little misfortune. By then, people were making efforts to avoid the church, and when the bell in the spire rang to mark the hour, they jolt and bless themselves before moving on. On opening day, only a handful showed besides Mettler's sister and 2 nephews. The children took to exploring as the adults filed into the main chamber. Before the ceremony could even begin, the 2 boys came tearing in, pale, claiming that they'd heard someone groaning inside the walls. Their mother went with them to check and returned just as pale to say she too could hear it. Mettler refused to listen for himself. He said that they were imagining things, or that the newer foundation was simply making noise while settling into the ground. However, the night cleaner reported similar noises. A groaning from inside the walls that was even harsher in the basement, frightening him so much that he had to leave the room. From there, a feeling of imminent danger followed, a coldness on the back of his neck that his presence wasn't wanted. Mettler fired him on the spot. Strange occurrences intensified in the following months. A spontaneous fire from candle wax was barely contained before spreading. Almost every week a new contractor had to fix another part of the building that had mysteriously deteriorated. Mettler blamed shoddy craft work, especially when the bells started going off at incorrect minutes, with not a soul touching the controls. Nothing he did prevented the details from finding ears. Attendance dwindled to the singles outside of his sister and nephews, who'd only stayed to help because he had insisted. When summer days drifted in and still his pews were almost empty, Mettler announced that he would be hosting a special sermon to celebrate the season. "It will be a mighty shame," he said, "if nobody shows and, in my disheartenment, I can't send money to fund any festivals this year." There was discussion, and eventually most decided that one gathering in Mettler's church would be worth keeping the town's biggest donor happy. On a hot June morning, large lines formed outside the entryway. Many a hand was clutching a personal crucifix. Mettler watched the aisles fill, smirking as no empty seat remained when it was time to begin. He ignored the swiveling heads searching for potential dangers. They faced him when he cleared his throat and opened his Bible to the chosen sections, all, of course, containing notes of personal interpretation. Recounts of what happened next are beyond belief, but those present are firm in what they experienced. Thomas Mettler was 2 paragraphs into reading when the ground quaked. He paused, and after a few seconds it ceased, so he started again, a little louder. After a page or so more, the shaking began again, but that time he did not halt, even as people began to murmur and stand up. When it was clear he was not going to regain their attention, he stopped. The shaking did too. Mettler scolded the audience for being distractible by something so small as an earth tremor. Then he continued preaching, and nothing happened for several minutes. However, the tremors soon returned, building from a low rumbling to strong enough to sway the chandelier above. As furniture fell from its places, the people shot up in the pews. Some struggled to gain balance from the movement of the ground. It was an earthquake. But an enraged Thomas Mettler did not halt his reading. Instead, he continued to try and shout over the noise, the panicked chatter of the crowd. His sister ran to him, begging him to evacuate the church, but he ignored her and kept shouting until his face was a beet red. It was then that each stained glass window shattered one by one, and a deep moaning echoed through the chamber. Mettler's sister scooped up her 2 sons by the waists, fleeing out the double doors. The crowd took to her example and stampeded towards the exit as Mettler threw his book at them and screamed that they wouldn't see a cent in donations ever again. Once outside, the people gathered as far from the church as possible. The earthquake could still be felt under their feet, but its center was the building itself. The steeple shook, bell banging back and forth in a painful, untimed toll. Suddenly, the concrete around the borders began to crack, and to the bewilderment of all witnesses, Mettler's church began to rise. It rose higher than the tallest roofs in town, so high that the sun cast the shadow of the church over everything, the tip of the spires reaching even the outskirts. Underneath, 2 long formations connected it to the ground. They were parallel towers of dirt and stone, broken cement twisted among the blended masses. The townsfolk stared in awed silence. Some noticed that the ends of the towers on their level were wider, clumped together in familiar shapes. Only when one of the mounds pulled free of the earth did they recognize what they were seeing. The clumps were feet, attached to legs. There was another tremor when the foot came down, and people finally found the awareness to flee. The other foot pulled loose as the same moan that had been heard inside the hall echoed from the top, where the church itself was turning with the fulcrum of its new limbs. It took a step, and then another, like a baby learning to walk. The street crumbled. Steps turned into a lumbering stride, and soon Mettler's church was stomping through town and flattening whatever structures were in its way. It didn't stop at the borough's edge, but kept moving into the countryside as the bell tolled and the stomps bashed toward the horizon. A long time passed before they faded. Miraculously, there weren't many serious injuries. In fact, the only fatality of the incident was Thomas Mettler himself, who was found crushed a few miles away in a sizable impression of soil. Some say it was a footprint. Outsiders labeled what happened as an earthquake and mass hysteria caused by the damage it inflicted. What no doubter could account for, however, was the crater in the ground where a church used to be. Eventually, the spot was smoothed out and left as an empty lot until years blurred the memory of what once occurred. If a passerby happened to glance in its direction and remember, they'd bless themselves and move on their way as if the curse still lingered. Mettler's church itself was never found. The last sighting was by a cattle rancher a short way from town, stopping to watch in disbelief as the walking shrine shambled across the fields. His herd raised their heads to moo and carry on, quieting when the shape disappeared into hills beyond. The rancher commented that he'd removed his hat and bowed his head as it happened, though he couldn't say exactly why. "Some things," he'd said, "some things just don't need explaining." And unexplained is where the matter rested, but to the town it was better that way. By one thing or another, Mettler's church had been cursed, and that was all there was to it.